They wrote to each other for years. Marlene Dietrich and Edith Piaf, the German-American star who had built herself into one of the most mythologized figures in international entertainment, and the woman from the streets of Belleville, who had become the voice of Paris, maintained a correspondence that the people close to both of them have described as something more than the ordinary letters of professional acquaintances who liked each other. They wrote about performing. They wrote about loneliness. They wrote about what it cost to be what they each were, and what the alternatives would have cost instead. They had met in New York in the late 1940s, in the years when Piaf was first establishing herself in America, and when Dietrich was already a figure of enormous international stature. The meeting was not the meeting of equals in terms of fame or position, but it was the meeting of equals in terms of something that fame and position cannot fully name. The specific understanding that comes from having spent decades giving a room everything you have and knowing from the inside what that giving requires and what it does to the person who does the giving. New York in the late 1940s was the city that Piaf had been working to conquer since her first American engagements, the city where the scale of success that the French entertainment world had given her would either translate or fail to translate into something equally real. She had had difficult early New York performances, and she had had extraordinary ones. She had learned the specific difference between an audience that is receiving a foreign performer with polite curiosity and an audience that has been reached in the way she needed to reach people. When Dietrich came into her life in this period, what Piaf encountered was someone who had already navigated the specific distance between European origins and American stardom, who had made the journey that Piaf was still making, and who had made it in her own very particular way. The friendship did not begin because the two women were similar. It began because they recognized something in each other that they rarely recognized in anyone: the quality of having arrived at what they were through a process that could not be explained to anyone who had not been through it. In October 1963, Edith Piaf died at her home in Plascassier in the south of France. She was 47 years old. She had been ill for years. The death was not a surprise in the way that sudden deaths are surprises. The people close to her had understood for some time that the end was approaching, had arranged the conditions of her last months with the specific combination of hope and practicality that accompanies the management of terminal illness. But the death of someone who has been the essential thing they were for decades produces its own particular shock, regardless of how long the approach was visible. Marlene Dietrich received the news in Paris. She was in her apartment there, the one she had maintained for years in the city that had been, for both of them, the city that mattered most. The accounts of her response describe it in the language of grief that has no appropriate expression, of someone who has received information that the mind understands and the rest of the person cannot immediately process. She had known this was coming. Knowing it was coming had not, when it came, made it otherwise than what it was. She spoke publicly about Piaf's death in terms that were, for Dietrich, who maintained throughout her career an almost professional restraint in matters of public emotional expression, notably unrestrained. She said that Piaf had been irreplaceable. She said that what had existed in Piaf's voice was something that could not be explained and would not recur. She said that she had lost a friend in the specific and precise sense that word carries when it names something built over time through the accumulation of trust and recognition. The public statements were the public statements. They were honest, but they were the version of the grief shaped for people who were not inside the friendship. The private version, the version available only in what Dietrich did in her apartment, alone, in the days after the news, is the version that the letter belongs to. the private grief of someone who has lost not a colleague or an admired peer, but a specific person who understood them in the way that only people who have been corresponding honestly for 15 years can understand each other. Dietrich understood performing from the inside. She had been on stages since the 1920s, in Berlin cabarets, in Hollywood films, on stages across the world. She had reinvented herself multiple times as the circumstances required. She had performed for Allied troops during the war, had maintained the performing even when her personal life was in disorder. She had not stopped. She understood Piaf's not stopping because she had done the same thing, in her own form, for the same reasons. What Piaf gave Dietrich in those years, in addition to the friendship and the correspondence, was the model for something specific, the solo performance. Dietrich, in the later years of her career, developed a one-woman show that became the form in which she continued to perform long after the films had ended. She studied Piaf's approach to the solo stage with the attentiveness of someone who is learning something she needs to know. She watched how Piaf managed a room, how a single performer, without sets or supporting cast, could hold an audience's complete attention through nothing more than the voice and the presence and the selection of songs. She learned from watching. And then she built her own version. The letters were in French. Dietrich's French was accomplished, and she used it naturally in the correspondence. She did not write to Piaf in English, the language of her American career, or in German, the language of her origins. She wrote in the language of the city they both loved. It was a specific act of meeting the other person where they were. Piaf's letters were direct and often funny. The humor is a detail that the people who have described the correspondence have emphasized, because it contradicts the impression of Piaf that the stage performances and the trajectory of her personal life combined to produce. The woman who wrote to Dietrich was someone who could be wry about the gap between the performing self and the private self, about the absurdities of the entertainment world, about the specific indignities and pleasures of a life conducted entirely in the public eye. She wrote to Dietrich as someone who would understand these things without needing them explained, and she wrote a letter. The accounts of this letter come from the people who were close to Dietrich in those weeks, the members of her professional entourage, her daughter, the people in the Paris apartment in October 1963 who observed what she did in the days after the news. She sat down and she wrote to Piaf. A letter addressed to a person who could no longer receive it, in the French that Dietrich had mastered in the years of living in Paris, directed at the person who had been receiving her words on paper for more than a decade. What the letter contained is not known in the way that published letters are known. It was private in the full sense, not written for an audience, not intended as a statement, but written because the writing of letters to Piaf was what Dietrich had been doing for years, and because the stopping of the correspondence required some form of acknowledgement that the abrupt cessation of a long habit does not provide. She wrote because the alternative was simply the absence where the letters had been. Dietrich outlived Piaf by almost 30 years. She died in Paris in 1992 at the age of 90. In the years between, she spoke about Piaf rarely in public, but when she did, she spoke with a precision and seriousness that made clear the friendship had not diminished in her memory. The one-woman show she had developed, the solo stage performance that took her around the world through the 1970s, carried, in its structure and in the quality of her presence on stage, the marks of what she had learned from watching Piaf hold a room. The debt was one she acknowledged privately to the people who asked in conditions where the honesty was appropriate. The correspondence had been about performing and loneliness and what it cost to be what they each were. It had been, like most real correspondence, about both the subjects discussed and the fact of the discussion, about the reality of being known by someone who knew from the inside the thing you were doing, and who wrote back, and whose letters you kept. The letters existed because the two women had looked at each other across the considerable differences of origin and language and professional circumstance, and found something that warranted the effort of maintaining the connection over 15 years of very busy lives. That something was the recognition. And the recognition was sustained by the letters in the same way that any sustained recognition is sustained, by the repeated act of saying again, "Yes, I see you," and receiving again the same. They had found each other in New York in the late 1940s, had recognized something in each other that their very different careers and very different origins had not prevented them from recognizing. They had written letters for 15 years, in French, about the things that mattered. And then one of them had died, and the other had sat down in her Paris apartment and written one more, and the correspondence was complete.